how do you get that young guy to like get that switch to flip to where he's hungry for recovery,
Yeah. Yeah.
And to me, like in all the cases that we work with, it takes time. And that you're right. I haven't worked with as many adults, older adults, but you don't hear of them oftentimes doing these longer term treatment stints, or at
That's
least
true.
I don't
Right.
like the
Yeah.
12-month, and maybe you can't, as an adult and you have a family and, more things are at stake.
Hello, I am B. Reeves with New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Finding New Waters. My name is B. Reeves. I'm the Director of Business Development at New Waters Recovery, and I'm with our CEO, who's also a clinician, Justin McClendon, and our very special guest today, David McNease in Greenville, South Carolina, who is the founder and owner of Greenville Transitions, which we will talk about, as well as Clean Breakthrough. So welcome, David.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you for being on.
Thank you for being on here despite having COVID for the 5th time. Appreciate that.
Yeah. It's good to be over the hill with that.
There we go.
God, I hear you. Yeah, good. Cool. Well, let's just get right into kind of what you do at Greenville Transitions. I've been there, but I'm not, going to try to tell our audience exactly what you do because it's your place.
Yeah. So I am the CEO of Greenville Transitions, which started as a young men's facility. And that's still the majority of what we do. We work with young men ages 17 to 28 who are struggling with substance use disorder, as well as maybe some failure to launch stuff of trying to get them back into the workforce or back into school because maybe they bombed out of one of those or both of those. Um, we also do some outpatient stuff with all ages, male and female, but that's a very small part of our programming day to day.
And you do, and just to be clear, clients can live at Greenville Transitions, the men at least, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
we have daytime programming at our clinical side, which is like a partial hospitalization level of care, intensive outpatient
Okay.
program. And then the guys they have a house setting where they live for anywhere. We are longer term too. So guys stay with us for like 7 to 12 months at a time.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's just one of the big things we believe in is time for these younger men.
Mhm. Time
Yeah.
takes time, they say.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. Well, I met David as I was introduced to him by a mutual friend of ours, and David had gone through the program where I originally worked when I first got into the field. And then right when I met David, I knew this is a good guy. And I've since been able to, we've been able to work together and see each other here and there. Would you tell us a little bit about how you found yourself in a place not too dissimilar from Greenville Transitions and just kind of a little bit mini version of your story?
Yeah, for sure. And it's tough to give a mini version. So if I need to
I hear you.
pause or move forward, fast forward a little bit, you just let me know. But yeah, I mean, and it's the reason that we mostly work with younger guys. It's because I was that guy. I'm the guy that needed help, that needed guidance in his late teens to early 20s, navigating, transitioning into adulthood, right? So, around 20, 21, 22, things were really taking a turn for the worse with me. I was dragging my family down, pushing friends away. I pretty much abused everything that I could get my hands on. Anything that would alter my state of mind was my ticket. So if it were alcohol, if I had alcohol readily available, would abuse that. If it were benzos, I would abuse those, which is like a Xanax or something of that nature. And then when I found opiates, that's when I really, really dove in. I was like head first. So if I had to list like a priority list, opiates would be at the top. And my father passed away in 2012, and that had a lot to do with me having a moment of clarity of like, gosh, what am I doing with my life? As I was showing up to the hospital to see him, like on his last days, and I'm like nodding out and drooling on myself. And I don't know how I had that moment of clarity, but I did. And I'm grateful for that. Um, Maybe it was my sisters or my mom nudging me saying, dude, what's going on? Um, so I was 23 years old, I believe, when, I finally, and a lot of other things happened, but I finally went to my mom and I said, I need help. I've got to have help and I'm going to have to go somewhere. Like I know that I can't do it alone. That's what I did know. Um, and it took her a couple of days, her and my sisters. Before I knew it, they came back to me and they said, hey, we found a place and I'm going to drive you on Monday. We're going to drive you up to Kentucky. I think that they can help you. And I was like, okay, cool. And it didn't happen immediately. I wish it would have been like hey, I found this place, get in the car right now. I remember having like a day or two to stew on it. And that was awful
Mhm.
for me because I was just like going back and forth of this. Do I really want to go? Do I want to give up this lifestyle? Even though I knew I was a slave to it. Um, it was my comfort. It was what I knew. So, why not sit in that comfort a little bit longer, even if it were causing chaos? Um, but I did go and was happy on the way there because I was high on the way there. I was using up the last of what I had to get the treatment. Um, but I also remember once I got there hating it. I was like, nope, I changed my mind. I don't want to do this. Come get me. Like I made a huge mistake here. This is not the lifestyle I want. Um, but luckily, my mom had this card that she could play with me, and she was like, "David, I just lost your dad. I don't want to lose you too.
Mhm.
Please stay." And refused to come get me. My sisters refused. Friends refused. Like I had no escape, and that was a really good thing for me. Is for them to hold hard boundaries and not rescue me in that moment. Um, and there were a lot of boundaries that had to be held in the upcoming weeks and months, even of treatment, where I was trying to pull away and say, no, I'm good now. Like I did 30 days. Surely I have this under my belt. Come get me. Okay, now I've got 3 months. I've got it all taken care of. Come get me. But they stuck with it. And, we built Greenville Transitions based a lot on my experience, and then our COO, Lucas, his experience of this, like, longer term model, um, and we're of mind that it takes time to build up, like, pride to be successful in that new way of life, and those are the things that kept me hanging on to sobriety, and eventually made me decide for myself, like, okay, I want to stick with this. Like, I'm no longer trying to bail. I want this way of life for me. It's not for my mom or my sisters as much. It became a David thing, a David journey. Um, so that's like a little snippet of my struggles, me getting into recovery. Um, and then I even knew early on into going to treatment and sober livings on my own that I wanted to turn around and help others navigate this
That's
difficult
awesome.
part of life. Yeah.
Well, you said so many interesting things there. One of them, just that period of when your mom said, "We've got a spot for you. We're going Monday."
Mhm.
And luckily, you did end up going because I can't tell you, and I'm sure you've seen more than I have, how many times somebody's ready, there's a window of opportunity, and then they wait and don't strike while they're on his side, and that person stews long enough in his or her own stuff and that comfortable chaos you talked about, and then ultimately doesn't go to treatment. That's not to say that they don't ever find it, but often that's the case.
Yeah.
I'm always telling people, asking for help is really hard. I commend you for it. But now it's time to receive and accept the help, because that's really the most important part of the whole equation.
Mhm.
Um,
Just to tag on to that too, I think the other piece that we see a lot of, doing the detox or the kind of initial step in this process, um, is individuals that come in. Maybe they got a plan, maybe they don't, maybe they're motivated for the next step in treatment, maybe they're not. But the team and stakeholders and family were able to get everybody on board, and the client's like, okay, I'm willing to go to treatment after I get
mhm.
stable, but I need to go hang out at home for, you name it, right? 1 day, 2 days, a week, so I can get X, Y, and Z in order. I mean, we hear this all the time, and it's a very similar situation. It's like we're telling them, because we've seen this time and time and time again. We're like, bad idea, need to go door to door. But of course, they're insistent that they know and everything's going to be fine. And I would say 80% of the time, unfortunately, they don't wind up making it. And to B's point, hopefully they make it later on, but yeah, it's tough. And as we all know, right? I mean, just taking the step in general is, it's a fearful process, right? I mean, you're stepping into something, there's no guarantees, you don't know. David, as you mentioned, the comfort of where you're coming from is just a much easier place to stay, easy, in air quotes.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's unfortunate that sometimes we can't just be like, "Hey guys, like this is what you need to do," and then that's it, right?
Yep, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the toughest things. It's just that waiting. The yes, I'm going to get help, tomorrow, and it's
Yeah.
just all right. Well, you've listened to everything we've said so far and seem to have gotten better at every step of the way. But then
Right.
there's this one other thing, and then that's when kind of often that's when they go back to taking their will back and knowing best.
Yeah.
The other thing about the long term. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just gonna say that a lot of the cases that I work with, when people actually get to a place where they're going to accept the help, it's because they've exhausted all of their other options.
Yeah.
But the
Yep.
Right.
thing about being an active addiction, or coming up in that lifestyle of the streets and getting your fix, like we're very manipulative and we're really good at problem
Right.
solving. Like you give me 2 hours, I'll have options that I didn't have you
Right.
know, 60, 90, 120 minutes ago.
Yeah, we're an
It's true.
industrious lot. If we could only, use it for good.
Yes.
Um, and the long term piece, especially with young adults, which you primarily serve. I didn't get sober and find recovery till I was 41, but I've worked in the field now for several years, and I feel like it's most important to have that that longer runway for people in that kind of failure to launch demographic, not just to, like, to your point, which is so true, is to it takes time to find drive and purpose and success, but to see and to be shown that life is better clean and sober, not just somebody wagging a finger at somebody for,
Mhm.
30, 45 days and just telling them over and over again, and then throwing them in AA meetings or NA meetings or whatever with people who are, they seem so old to them. That's
Mhm.
all part of it. That's important, but to also be with people and see people their own age really enjoy life
Yeah.
clean and sober, and see it happen.
Oh, yeah. That was such a fear of mine. Like, as I'm weighing out, because I like to look at it as percentages as I'm moving through my recovery. There's like, in the beginning, is like 2% of me wanted to be sober, 98% of me didn't. And like as time went on, that percentage of wanting to be sober increased. Um, And eventually I get closer to that 50-50. Like 50% of me wants to be sober, half of me doesn't. And then boom, something happens and I flip over to that 51%. And even after I flipped over to that, I had these fears of like, well, if I'm not drinking and getting bars, and like, how am I going to find, a wife one day? How am I going to like, that's how my brain was wired. This is how we
Yeah.
find people in the wild. It's you go to bars and parties and stuff like that. So, yeah, to your point, I think being able to see other people my age that were like successful and making relationships work and careers work and like wanting to go meet with sponsors and do those types of things was extremely helpful.
Yeah. Well, you said another thing too that just that we're always trying to Justin and I and you and the collective us that we are always trying to help people understand is, and you just said it. We can get sober for our moms and our wives and our kids and our coworkers and friends or whatever, but we can only stay that way for us. And it sounds like that I probably had a little bit of that too, where that initially that 2% of wanting to do this was really because, I had a very similar experience. We've never discussed this about, my dad was diagnosed with cancer about a year before I got sober. And I was, visiting him in the hospital and not very present when I was doing it. And then he died. And then, it was all, to me, a big ironclad, airtight excuse for me to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, especially drugs.
Mhm.
And then, but it led to my sobriety, but that 2% initially of doing it for somebody else, but then with every little bit of success, feeling a little bit better here in the physical department, the mental department, the spiritual, then that percentage goes up. And then, like you said, you get to maybe that tipping point when it gets to be over 50%, then it's like, wait a minute, this is better. Why would I go back?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it takes more time for the younger man to see that
Hmm.
than the older man for some reason. I mean, my guess is, and maybe we could talk about this being like, I was
Hmm.
23 when I got sober. You were how old? 41.
41. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I hadn't experienced much success on my own at 23 years old. And if I'm being honest, even a lot of the achievements that I had um, received up to that point, like I could attribute to my parents, like their
Hmm.
home, the jobs that my dad gave me, or worked out for me in the community, um, the sports that they put me in practices for. But there wasn't a lot of like David David achievements that have nothing to do with anyone else. And I think as a 41-year-old, maybe you get a little more of that, more experience out in the career world or the school world, or um, and maybe it doesn't take as much time to see
No,
that.
that
Like,
it's funny you say that because the way I would look at it is the achievements were in the equation, but it was more my lack of them and my perception of lack of them. So the longer I was alive and the less I felt like I was doing and watching everybody else pass me by, that was
Hmm.
kind of what ate at me and ate at me and ate at me. And then, over time, it was just the only way I could handle that perceived failure was just to cover it up with drugs and alcohol until finally, due to a series of circumstances, including the illness and subsequent death of my father, I would just, I finally hit a bottom, got to treatment, and heard people say, sick and tired of being sick and tired. I was like, yes, that's exactly right.
yeah.
Justin was a little bit of a younger guy.
Yeah, for sure. And I also spent a lot of time, just like you did, David, working specifically with the younger adult population, specifically men. Actually, in the first part of my career, like that was my passion. That was my thing. That's what I could relate closest to,
Mhm.
and I've often questioned those same things. I mean, it seems pretty clear, I think, to anybody that's worked with that young adult population that, like, yes, like being with, similar aged individuals, longer term treatment, heavy emphasis on like life skills and just learning how to like quote unquote live in sobriety is crucially important if that person's going to be successful. But to that same point, comparing that to I've spent now, let's call it the second half of my professional career, working with more of a mixed bag of individuals, all adults, a lot of them tend to be more middle aged and things like that. And it's very interesting, and it's easy, I think, to hone in on these little variables. To B's point, like maybe that person's just in a different place in life, or they have a different outlook on it. But you can poke holes in so many of those arguments, right? That I even at this place, and I've been practicing in this field for 15 years now or something like that, and, like, I don't really know if I have the answer to that, to be honest with you. I mean, I think there's the obvious, like, kinda developmental, like, cognitive piece of of, the older person has obviously just seen more life than the younger person. So there's something to that. But I don't know, man, because you'll see the older person that has, like B said, maybe they haven't even really had a lot of successes or experiences or anything like that. And maybe a little bit more childlike when compared to other adults. But then you'll also see an adult that, maybe they didn't even develop a problem until later on, and they've been successful and they've done some really good stuff, but yet their behavior and how they react when given the opportunity to be in recovery or to change their life, maybe a little bit more childlike than you would expect that adult to be. So I don't know. It's a hard thing to predict, I think.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, and that's where, I ask myself all the time, like, how do you get that young guy to like get that switch to flip to where he's hungry for recovery,
Yeah. Yeah.
And to me, like in all the cases that we work with, it takes time. And that you're right. I haven't worked with as many adults, older adults, but you don't hear of them oftentimes doing these longer term treatment stints, or at
That's
least
true.
I don't
Right.
like the
Yeah.
12-month, and maybe you can't, as an adult and you have a family, and more things are at stake sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, as we're continuing to talk about this, I'm thinking, I wonder if you have the same experience, but thinking back on that part of my professional career, one thing that really seemed clear to me is that when it came to treatment and like whether or not treatment was, whether or not the milieu of clients were like being successful or not, the one thing that always seemed to be a key ingredient for me was the culture, right? So like if everybody, if getting well was cool and that's what everybody in that milieu was doing, then that's what everybody was doing.
Yeah.
But if you had like a handful of people that weren't doing that, then that would be the cancer that would take over the majority of the group. And, talking about this kind of thing, I've always wondered if, maybe some of that is like you're just not young enough, or young enough to where you just really haven't identified, who you are as your own individual identity. And you need that group of individuals, right? To
Mhm.
be able to kind of, get in the middle of the pack and have them guide you towards sobriety, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about that? Have you had that same experience, David?
I have, but then I'm thinking about my personal experience, and I feel like I was a little
Sure.
more of an outlier.
Okay.
As the majority of the house I was in when I got past treatment to like that sober living, transitional living, I remember having to weed through the guys in that house and be like, hey, if I want this, I can't hang out with the majority of these people. Um,
Mm,
like I'm gonna have to pick out two or three and maybe just hang out with my sponsor more, but I can't stick around this milieu. And as I'm saying it, I'm trying to think through like, yeah, I think maybe it's just I felt like I had so much at stake. Like I'd put my
Yeah.
family
mhm.
through so much. Um, my dad had just passed away, and now I'm left. I need to mention this too. Then I only have sisters, so it's like a household
Okay.
of females to where I did feel this like I've got to step up. You know, we just
Gotcha.
lost the man of the household, and I need to be present. Um, I don't know. So maybe I just have more at stake, but you're
Mhm.
right. I do largely see what you're talking about. Where if it's a healthy community and a good milieu, you'll see it trend that direction. But if you have those the bad eggs in there, they're pulling it the other way. If you can't
Yes,
get that out, then it can tear a house apart for sure.
that's true.
Yeah, we see it, unfortunately from time to time at New Waters where we just have that one guy who's not very serious about it, who's been to treatment 50 times and comes in and, you know, bashes everything treatment or recovery related. And fortunately, it doesn't affect everybody in there, but, I mean, for sure, it keeps people from going to further treatment
Yeah.
from time
Mhm.
to time. And
And you love that person too, right? You want that person to get better. So it's
Yeah.
difficult. And
yeah,
I think that's, yeah, it's one thing I think in our careers that we just have to, or in this line of work that we have to just come to terms with is you can't make people get better.
yeah,
Mhm.
It'd be nice if we could,
yeah.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
but you can't.
I mean, the perfect, the ideal ingredients are just total bottom and being put in front of a person like you, David, right then, or Justin, right then, and then everybody's on fire for it and they're doing it for themselves right away. But it's just unfortunately not usually how it works. And people need some more time and some more guidance. Um, but but back to the, stick with the winners, they told me, and, I tried to do that, but I think kind of like you were saying, I was ready. That's the most important thing. I was ready, and I was, for the first time in my life, my mom would always tell me as a kid, when all else fails, read the directions. And I wouldn't even listen to that. And for the first time, I was willing to read and take some, read directions, take instructions. And, when I hear stories about people in the rooms, and people being negative, and people who are any kind of nefarious activity, I've been around several years now, and I don't want to be one of those people who says I've got a few 24 hours, but long enough to have seen some stuff. And I've just never had that experience. And I don't know what that says about the people I surround myself with, or that if I'm just naive and blind, I don't know. But in treatment and in recovery, the recovery community since then, I haven't personally witnessed or really seen somebody influencing others in a negative way, but I guess it's out there.
June. Yeah. Yeah. It's,
So tell us, you've got a podcast too, right?
yeah. Yeah. Or it's more of a, like, it's not on Spotify or anything, but it's more of just a social media platform thing, like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. And it's called Clean Breakthrough. And I think it more so speaks to families, like the mom and dads of the younger person. Um,
Perfect.
because it's a lot of, like, sharing personal experiences and interviewing young guys who have gone through recovery programs and are doing really well now. And a lot of what I'm asking is like, what was it? What was that big thing? You know,
Mm.
what got you to that turning point where it was not about mom and dad anymore? It was for you, like you wanted this. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
What kind of answers are you getting?
Um, like, I think again, the biggest one is like separation away from that lifestyle to where um it takes a while to see change. I think other people would see, even with myself, other people would see the change within me before I could see it. I could remember a therapist saying, like, hey, man, you can actually like sit still for longer than 30 seconds. You're not like pacing the room. And it's like, I guess that is a positive thing. um, but from like small things like that to the biggest one is success. Like being able to see that, like, oh, maybe I can be successful leading this type of lifestyle. Like maybe I don't have to hide behind this mask of like drugs and alcohol to cover up my fears. And like maybe I can make it out here in the world. It's not that scary of a place. And it took time, it takes time to see that.
I love that you said that. I'm sure I've shared this on here before on this podcast, but when I got to treatment, it was not my idea. I knew I was in trouble. I got on my knees the night I got there and just wept and said, God, what have you done to me? And then I paced around and moped for 3 days and said, I'm leaving tomorrow. And then I was like, all right, I'm not leaving. How can I make it go by fast? Only way I knew how was to participate. Thought about being a kid in church when I didn't pick up a hymnal and sing along. It would take forever to sit down again. But if I sang along, it went by fast. I could sit down again. And so I just applied that to treatment. I was like, maybe I'll learn something. So I did learn something, which was my way of doing things got me there. Half a room at this place, what they said.
Mhm.
And then started feeling better physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. And I was getting out of the shower one day right after I started feeling better. And I would call a spiritual experience
Mhm.
where I felt a voice, didn't hear, but felt a voice tell me I was going to be successful. And I didn't take that as I was going to be rich and famous, just that I was going to be okay.
Mhm.
But part of me, finally had some positive intuition that also said, this is going to take work. And it's not that I was just struck sober and was going to be good to go forever, but I did have that real kind of white light kind of moment but it felt the feeling, not a voice, but a feeling tell me I was going to be successful, but I knew that it would take work and, and I still work on it.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't really have that like aha moment or lights clicked really all at once. It was such a gradual thing for me, you know.
Hmm.
I can even remember thinking like months, 3 or 4 months. I guess it was 3 months into treatment as I was like getting ready to go to a sober living, transitional living. I picked a place. Um, I picked a place where I could go where I had friends at that location. So if I needed an exit plan, it was easier to do that, to go get high. There were friends that were using still, and um, so and that's a thing I think that's hard for a lot of parents to hear is they're like, "Wait, wait, wait. You mean 3 months into this process, you were still like you had those kind of thoughts?" And I was like, "Yeah." Like it was not like an easy transition for me. Um, but luckily I kept hanging out with the right people and taking suggestions of others for some reason. Like I did know enough that, like you said, my way of thinking had gotten me to where I was. So maybe, just maybe, I should take chances and like listen to some others that are doing pretty well.
Yeah. You just made me think of a quote by C.S. Lewis. You guys know who C.S. Lewis is? I'm probably going to butcher it too, but he's basically says something along the lines of, spiritual growth is like the warming of a cold room. It doesn't happen abruptly, but it happens over a period of time. I always think about that, David, to your point that just sitting in a cold room, like at some point you're like, oh, I'm not cold anymore, but I don't really know what happened in between now and then. You know what I mean? It's a
Yeah.
cool way of thinking
Yeah, it
about
is.
it.
And to piggyback on that, I mean, I went on this thing when I was 22 with this Crow Indian guide, and I were just walked through the Bob Marshall National Forest and Glacier when I was, failing out of school, and there was, some DUIs. I mean, I was a mess, and this wasn't to go get me sober. It just got me out of life for a while, and it was really hard to get warm. And this guy one night I was so wet and cold, just like, oh my god. Finally, get the fire roaring, and I can kind of take my hat off and my gloves off and just the pullover, and then if there's wind, put something back on. And he looked at me, he said, "You know, it's a lot easier to stay warm than to get warm." And I was like, oh, and I kind of knew that would come into play throughout my life, but it really, and kind of back to that, yes, I would say I had a spiritual experience getting out of that shower that day. But for me to continue to have a spiritual awakening of the educational variety and to maintain, the maintenance of my spiritual condition comes from that, keeping the fire going. It's
There
a
you
lot
go.
easier for me to stay sober than to get sober all over again, which what I can't even imagine having to do. That would
Yeah.
not be it's a nightmare.
Yeah. And I want to touch on that because that's such a foreign thing to a person struggling with substance use disorder is to wait.
Mm.
Like we're not conditioned to wait. Like we
Mhm.
we are used to taking a pill and feeling better immediately, or taking a drink and feeling better like in the next 30 minutes. And
Mhm.
to be fair, I mean, I think society is kind of like everyone's kind of headed that direction too. Like you want to lose weight, there's a pill for that. Like you don't want to have
Yep.
anxiety, there's a pill for that. It's
Yeah,
this
it's
like
true.
immediate gratification world that we live in. So the concept of you're telling me this is going to take time, that's a tough pill to swallow. um, and as a young man, I think that is why I struggled so much, is because I also went into treatment with a ton of anxiety, panic attacks, depression, and I wanted immediate change for that. And I can remember in my head being like, okay, bartering with myself, like, okay, I'm going to give myself a week. And if my anxiety isn't better in a week, like sobriety's not for me. Well, guess what? It take when you remove like substances from someone and then their medications, like it's going to take a little longer than a week to like even back out.
Right.
Um, but it was so hard for me to wrap my head around that. But like, this takes time.
Yeah. Well, we talk about this a lot on here too, just how cliches and slogans, they exist for a reason, especially in recovery. And, one that's not recovery specific is good things come to those who wait. And I mean, it couldn't apply more than here because, yeah, I mean, we're all conditioned as humans and Americans to,
Mhm.
For instant gratification. And that's a big part
Mhm.
of this whole thing is that being willing to do things we don't want to do
Yep.
that are suggested of us. And then sometimes, even more importantly, is willing to not do things we want to do, which will give us instant gratification.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I also got big into, like, working out and stuff in early recovery, and you see a lot of younger people do that, I think, as they're getting into
Mhm.
sobriety
Yep.
and become even obsessive with the gym. And I think a big reason was because it was easier for me to see change, like, physically see it in the mirror than feel it. Like, than to
Mm.
feel that anxiety and that depression and so that's why we encourage a lot of the younger people that we work with, like, "Hey, let's get active again." And maybe the gym's not your thing, but let's go on some hikes. Let's start moving your body again. Let's get some better sleep hygiene, get on a better sleep regimen, get diet dialed in a little better, and you'd be surprised at how much better you feel just when you adjust that. Because in most cases, all those things can be out of sorts when you're coming out of active use.
Yeah, absolutely. And that physical representation sometimes of how we're actually getting better from the inside out, it is helpful to sort of see it. I get that.
Mhm.
I lost a bunch of weight when I got sober. And I was working really hard on my program of recovery, but also starting to work out and eat right, and weight was kind of falling off. And on New Year's Day, I went from 278. I was right at 200 pounds. And I was really was like wanted to get below 200 pounds for the first time since I was probably 18 or 19 years old. And I weighed exactly 200 pounds on New Year's Day. I mean, exactly 200. I was like, oh, so close. And then the next morning, I had to be back at work on January 2nd, 5 a.m., going to the gym, doing my routine, freezing cold. Nobody's on the highway driving out on I-40. But I wake up and I got on the scale and I weighed 199.2. And I just remember thinking, yes.
Yeah.
And then I got in the car to drive out to Cary, which is a suburb of Raleigh, for those who don't know, to my office. Nobody's on the road. It's the day after. It's January 2nd, 5:30 in the morning, going to the gym. And as I'm driving out there in the dark by myself, I just started weeping and laughing and crying and belly laughing. And I'd never felt anything like it. And it was pure ecstasy and joy and all of this stuff happening at once. It wasn't just the weight loss. It was just this completely new way of living that I never thought possible, all kind of, becoming a reality.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
That's very cool. Very cool.
Well, David, how do we find you?
Um, so Greenville Transitions, greenvilletransitions.com or Greenville Transitions Recovery Center, that's like our clinical side of things. And then on social media platforms, I am at Clean Breakthrough.
Very cool.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And I hope you feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.